Let me quickly introduce Peter so you know who's speaking to you if you have never met in person. Peter is the Director of Online Strategy at the University of California, Davis Libraries, where he designs new applications and services to connect research from the university with the public. Previously, he was the Director of Digital Development at the New York Public Library, and before that, the Director of Scholarly Communication at the open source non-for-profit Hypothesis. Peter has worked at the Internet Archive on policy issues and open standards and has managed technology groups at a variety of academic research libraries. With the Frankfurt Book Fair, so our host today, he convened a leading edge publishing conference called Books in Browsers. I'm sure many of you have seen that. Peter has served on advisory boards for several publishing groups, including the Community of Literary Magazines and Presses, the Collaborative Knowledge Foundation, the University of California Press, the American Geophysical Union, the Rebus Foundation, and the American Association of University Presses. Peter will talk to us about, as you can already see on the slides, the struggle for innovation, the resilience of form, and we are very much looking forward to that. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Sven, and thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you to Frankfurt for having me today. I'm going to probably see if I can maximize your screen here. But at any rate, so today what I would like to talk about is how publishing has responded at various times to the opportunities to engage in significant technological change. And my interest in this comes from a specific era in the early 2000s when I and a cohort of friends and colleagues believed for a time that a new surge of web technology might make a significant fundamental difference in publishing. And we became quite the evangelists for that. And to our surprise, that didn't happen. And so on reflection, I would like to talk with you and think with you about why publishing wound up, in effect, resisting the kind of change that we anticipated and what that might mean for the future. I think with the hindsight of a lens of some sociology of markets, because I'm a lapsed academic, that we can begin to understand a little bit better the position of publishing and the broader ecosystem of organizations and how they respond to change. There's no, I should say, no value judgment here. I think in retrospect, publishing did as expected and probably in many ways did the right thing. But what I would like to do is to try to understand how that happened. So about 2008, earlier or later, there was a change or maturity emerging in web software where what became known as an open web stack emerged. So what this meant was that suddenly the browser, the web browser, Chrome, Firefox, Edge, became much more powerful and able to perform many more tasks on your screen, on your laptop or your desktop computer than had been the case before that. And as a consequence, a whole bunch of us in software who also were involved and interested in proponents of publishing began to feel that a different vision for books moving to the web could emerge. And this vision of books was one in which books were very interactive, they were accessible in the same way that a web page was accessible, and they became deeply interlinked with each other. And in our world, we live in a world of technical acronyms like HTTP, JSON, REST, OPDS. These words, I don't want to dive into what their meaning is, but this was a very much of a world that was technically underpinned by new standards and new protocols. And the vision that we had was that pretty much publishing across the board would be transformed, that barriers to authoring texts would be reduced, that the costs of producing and distributing texts and other forms of published materials would be dramatically lowered because we were working with the web, and that new models of content would emerge, that we would be able to use web browsers to enable new forms of interactivity. And with that, publishing would be able to enter in new markets for their content. They'd be able to envision reaching new audiences. And while we were aware that there was a problem with bounding texts, obviously publishers must sell books or journals, and these things cannot be entirely free on the web. We felt that this was going to be a solvable challenge, and we would have the tools to begin to move toward their solution. So this sort of zeitgeist, if you will, I want to sum up through the words of one of my good friends, Eliza Daily. And I don't want to cast aspersions on Liza. I think she just said it very bluntly. We all felt this. So in response to a question from an interviewer, Brad Newberg, what do you think a next generation ebook should be? Liza's response was unbundled and completely incompatible with the publishing supply chain. So this was something that we all kind of believed. We all thought that we would be able to introduce new models to publishing, that things would be transformed, that publishing would accept this new world. And startups bloomed in the after 2008, 2009, 2010, and new tools for authoring, publishing, and distribution did begin to emerge. And additionally, new hosting platforms for published content also began to start up. There were some early stage AI experiments, particularly in terms of recommending new titles or new articles for readers. And most of the startups sought some kind of investment, either direct investment, sometimes joint ventures, sometimes partnerships. And I think across the board, none of the startups in this space sought to be the next major trade house. They didn't really want to usurp a Random House, or John Wiley. They just wanted to be fulfill a different part of the publishing ecosystem. They began to think of themselves as service providers or tool providers. So they didn't really self-identify as traditional publishers. But really quickly, within about 5 years, it was obvious to most of the startups that this dream that we had would be very elusive. And really, very quickly, the first wave of startups evaporated. Many of the firms had pivoted into new areas. They took their expertise and started doing something else. Some of them morphed into adjacent areas of publishing, but exited their original vision. Some of them shrank down to essentially consultancies. Many of them just vanished. And to a large extent, I felt very much part of this sudden this very quick arc because it was mirrored by a conference that I put on called Books and Browsers, which Sven alluded to early. Books and Browsers originally was put on with O'Reilly and the Internet Archive in San Francisco, and was very much a San Francisco conference, attracting about 100 to 150 leading technology innovators in publishing. And then it moved to the Frankfurt Book Fair. We retained it in San Francisco. But by 2012, it was becoming clear that we were cresting. And by 2013, it was becoming obvious that we ourselves were needing to pivot into a new area, that the sense of traction was lost, and the opportunity that we had envisioned was ebbing away. There were some successes. Several of the authoring tools that emerged wound up being acquired by established firms. So Authoria by Alberto Pepe was acquired by John Wiley. Poetica by Blaine Cook. Blaine was the original engineer at Twitter. Poetica was a collaboration annotation engine, was acquired by Condé Nast. Aereo by Ron Martinez was acquired by Ingram. And there were several new academic platforms that emerged for publishing, housed within universities or friendly to them. Several of them supported by the Mellon Foundation. So Manifold, Fulcrum, Pressbooks, all continue to this day to support relatively niche but important audiences. So looking back, I think the question for all of us who were involved in this and protagonists was, why didn't publishing change? Did we all somehow miss this opportunity? Was publishing just too slow or too lethargic to innovate? Was there a lack of incentives? And what does this mean for the future for publishing and how technology interacts with publishing? So to begin to understand what happened here, first I want to introduce quickly an alternative scenario, a scenario where things worked out really differently in the interflux between a new technological regime and an established existing industry. And that alternative scenario involves biotechnology. Now, biotech was just a brand new science in the same way that the internet was, rapidly emerging. So did the world of biotechnology, and it emerged originally in the 1950s, but really exploded in the late 70s with the emergence of DNA synthesis and sequencing and certain types of cell fusion technologies. And this broadly mirrored an explosion of biological sciences in higher ed. University labs became very competitive with each other. They began to watch who was working where, what were they doing, how were they innovating. And it's also important to keep in mind that biotech wasn't just a single industry like the internet, but it affected many different areas of life, particularly medicine, agriculture, vet science, really anything that intersected with the biological world. And when you think about biotech in comparison to biopharmaceuticals, it was just a radically different way of doing science and particularly drug development. The fundamental science is different. You're working with genetics, not chemistry. Typically, you're working with very small biological chemicals, not chemical compounds. And biological synthesis is what drives the development of therapeutics. So in the world of biotechnology, compared to established biopharmaceuticals, product development is extremely new and different. It's a very different kind of world. And just as the kind of frame that I discussed earlier, suddenly there was this explosion of biotech companies in the 70s and particularly in the 80s. Hundreds of companies were created in the first 10 years, and more than $60 billion in US dollars was invested by 1993 from the late 70s. Very rapid investment of money. And the first big market-making firms went public in the very early 1980s. So this was really rapid. Genentech in South San Francisco, which was founded at UCSF, went up in 1980. Amgen, which involved in part scientists at UCLA, went public in 1983. So these were very rapidly ascendant companies. But biotech, I think, as we can all appreciate from what we hear daily about the development of COVID vaccines, has very high barriers. Clinical testing is expensive, drawn out, and complicated. The need to get in the US FDA approval and the equivalent in the EU and in other countries has very high barriers. These are not trivial aspects to moving product to market. They're very, very high stakes regulatory environments, so where if you are dinged as a developer of a new pharmaceutical, you have to move back at least weeks, sometimes months, occasionally years. And scaling production and distribution would be extraordinarily difficult for small science-based firms. They just did not have this expertise. And yet the returns could be huge. The first drugs out of Genentech were human growth hormone, which was sort of a trial for Genentech to see how does this all work? How does this product development thing go? And then they followed that with something much more market-moving, TPA, which is used in the resolution of strokes. Amgen came out with Epigen, which dramatically improves oxygenated blood by improving blood cell count. Also, big market mover. And so in consequence, biopharmaceutical started forming deep partnerships with biotechnology, and biotech and established biopharmaceuticals emerged in a symbiotic relationship. Essentially, biopharm could not afford to ignore the tremendous promise and the new forms of science emerging out of biotechnology. And in correspondence, biotech desperately needed the financial reserves that biopharmaceuticals had to manage the drug approval process, production, and distribution. So they really realized they had to start working together. So a wide range of partnerships emerged very rapidly and very deeply. Not only research agreements with university labs and early biotech companies, but there was almost immediate licensing of products, tools, and science. There were many investments being made by established companies in these small companies, and a significant number of joint ventures emerged. And basically, biopharmaceuticals looked upon this new way of doing things and figured that they had to figure out how to manage product development in this new world. That, essentially for biotech, the transaction costs were too high for biopharmaceuticals just to keep them at bay. They had to figure out how to bring the science technology in-house. And so ultimately what happened was that biopharmaceuticals wound up acquiring many of the biotech companies, usually after they had proven themselves with the first product launch. And they handled the acquisitions initially by creating subsidiaries as they learned this new way of doing science, and then slowly over time brought the firms more deeply integrated into the companies. And in consequence, rapidly, even by the mid-'80s, certainly by the early '90s, few big independent biotech firms persisted. So this was a really interesting efflorescence of a new form of technology and a very rapid absorption of that technology by an established technology, biopharmaceuticals, with the emergence of a new way of building therapeutic products. So what can we learn here? Well, first of all, biotech did not supplant pharma, right? And biopharma was able to integrate biotech science and product development into their existing ways of doing business. So if you think about it from a sociology of markets perspective, basically the standard techniques that biopharmaceuticals had of running their businesses were able to manage the uncertainty presented by biotech. And biopharma stabilized their industrial networks. They figured out how to do biotech within biopharma. So the broader lessons, I think, are that once a market sector like publishing or biopharmaceuticals is established, it's really hard to disrupt. And even the firms that are disruptors are dependent on existing norms within the industry. And full bear market failure only results for something really sudden and very big, like if the government decides to make a sudden entrance into the industry by new forms of regulation, or something unexpected emerges, like the rise of the internet. And obviously, we have a new major disruption, unfortunately, a not unexpected, but not anticipated pandemic. So in order, I think, to understand both biotech, what happened there with biopharmaceuticals, and the counterposition of publishing, let's take a quick dive into some very basic sociology of markets. Now, as I alluded, I'm actually sort of a lapsed academician, and what I studied was market sociology, the rise, development of organizations, how they respond to economic opportunity, and particularly how they respond to product innovation. And I want to introduce a couple of core fields and then bring us quickly back at the end to how they help us understand publishing by looking at the examples of this wave of technology innovation in the early 2000s and how it failed to impact publishing, and biotech and how it did impact biopharmaceuticals. So the first concept I want to introduce is called an organizational field. And this comes out of a thread of sociology called Institutionalism, but this is a simple concept, and it essentially means all the organizations that you do business with as a publisher. Your suppliers, your customers, who helps you make distribution, how you make deals, and any agencies that regulate the way that you do business. In publishing, regulation's relatively lightweight, but obviously in other fields, regulation is quite significant. For pharmaceuticals are a case in point. Now, within an organizational field, sociologists tend to notice that all the firms firms in that field look pretty similar. And they arc towards stable relationships. So in an organizational field, you'll see organizations that basically are looking pretty much like each other. So a Macmillan might look in many ways like Simon & Schuster and so forth. And this kind of what we call isomorphism emerges in several different ways. And I'll talk about these very briefly. But one way is coercive, that there's sort of a force that compels that. Another way is memetic, where an organization copies another organization. And then there's something called normative isomorphism, which in many ways I think is most important for publishing. And that has to do with shared professionalism and backgrounds. So coercive isomorphism is where, for example, the government regulates all firms in an industry and says you have to do X or Y, or where there's a very strong dominant firm that essentially sets standards within an industry that other firms have to copy because there's basically no choice. A memetic isomorphism comes about when one company innovates in a way that's easily copied and where people see where that innovation is highly productive or increases profit or opens up a new opportunity. So a memetic process is one where an innovation ripples across an organizational field fairly quickly. Now, memetic processes has a flip side in that this kind of back and forth typically dissuades massive disruptions because you don't want somebody disrupting your organizational field. Now, normative pressure, as I said, in many ways to me is one of the most interesting in a micro level within publishing because it stems from the growth of professions. Well, what happens is professionalism tends to smooth out behaviors. When everybody goes to the same universities to learn a skill or understand an industry, you're often coming from very similar social and quite often also economic backgrounds. And this educational experience tends to channel people into a common way of thinking. And even post-education, networks among professions within a professional field reinforce this kind of commonality. And I think you can see that in publishing quite strongly, particularly in trade publishing, but also academic publishing. And people tend to move from across one firm to another firm, spreading this kind of similarity very easily from firm to firm. This is actually not the way that all industries work, but it's very, very common in publishing. Additionally, credentialism in some fields like law or medicine can restrict external entrants or ideas from emerging within an industry that's well established. And then the second major concept that I want to introduce before we move back to publishing is called a conception of control. Now, what a conception of control is within an industry, within a sector, there's a shared perception of how a market works. And then this enables executives within the firms in that market to understand each other's actions. Usually within an organizational field with a common conception of control, you don't look over at your neighboring firm CEO and think, what the heck did he just do? Usually you understand, why is somebody doing what they're doing? Why did they take that action? Why are they merging with that firm or acquiring this other firm or adopting this other technology? And this conception of control, it moderates acceptable forms of competition and cooperation. And it also produces organizations that look a lot like each other, not just externally, but internally as well. Because you all have to have marketing departments. You all have to figure out how to do the editorial function and so forth. And so firms start looking a lot like each other. So all of these functions, this isomorphism, this conception and control, means that stability in an industry is really durable. And once that stability emerges, it's really hard to disrupt or undermine it. And incumbents like biopharmaceuticals may vie for market share And as we've seen in trade publishing recently, there may be big acquisitions, but there's a refrain from direct and destructive competition where you're trying to wipe out major numbers of firms within your field. And challengers into this kind of domain are treated basically with the same kinds of behavior that created the stability in the first place. So let's take these concepts and move back into particularly publishing and biotech and try to understand with those sort of frameworks, those theoretical frameworks, what happened. Well, publishing clearly wasn't biotech. Publishing responded to this wave of internet enabled companies, web-enabled companies in a really different way. Publishers had a very well understood and stable organizational field. And while the invaders, the companies that in many ways I was part of and representative, saw really massive disruptive revolution in how publishing worked, the mandate for product transformation in publishing was lacking, compared to biotech, where the new way of doing science was very compelling, right? People knew we had to use these tools to build new products. Wasn't the case in publishing. And technology and publishing have very different professional worlds. Remember normative isomorphism? Professionals come from very different communities. They speak different languages. They went to different schools. They had very different expectations for how business works. And in addition, I think consumers would have had to accept really novel product forms, and publishers were right to be skeptical that that was a transformation that could move very quickly through an organizational field. And publishers would have had to change radically, not just in how they do business, but internally as well. So there are a lot of counter incentives looking back for publishers to try to adopt this wave of tech. And many people might say, well, Amazon's been really disruptive. And I would say, yes and no. It has been very disruptive, but in some ways not fundamentally so. Neither ebooks nor print books was transformed as a product, and conceivably that could have happened. And B2B distribution successfully evolved in many ways by expanding, right? There were initiatives already in place like print on demand that just expanded to take up this new model of distribution that Amazon presented. And from publishers' perspective, the merit and functional aggregation of book sales, licensing, and reading never really was questioned by Amazon's emergence as a major retailer. But in contrast, by the early 2000s, web tech had offered a solution to publishing that attempted to solve what to publishing was a dilemma that really wasn't evident to them. And so in consequence, it wasn't accepted. No publisher was willing to threaten their market stability and diverge from this comfortable, stable environment on the risk of taking up a new technology with an uncertain reward. Now, I think it's interesting that some of the open source solutions found homes. We pointed out some authoring tools, for example, typically within lower margin sectors like certain types of academic publishing and in the university market, not within trade publishing or large academic publishers as much. So I think that what this suggests and what a lens of sociology of markets and in an industry analysis suggests is that the text form, how publishing works and what publishing produces, will be fairly durable in the foreseeable future. Now, there are new novel forms of knowledge representation emerging, particularly in areas of the academic environment that border closely on publishing. Things like data as a concept of a publication, or the rise of web-based interactive simulations and modeling, and the increasing use of abstractions to link concepts together on the web. But these are not core to publishing as much as they are supportive of the publishing endeavor. So I think publishing's in a really interesting market. I think in the near term, challengers are not likely to fundamentally threaten incumbents within the organizational field. If you think about it, neither Netflix nor Crunchyroll are likely to become a threat to current publishers. It's really hard to see how publishing could be massively disrupted down to its bones. However, that doesn't mean that market erosion won't continue and that the size of the available market might shrink. And I think that's something that we've seen over the last few years, particularly last 5 years, I think. And there's no reason why that erosion won't continue to some degree. There's a little bit of a trend toward a diminishing demand of traditional publishing products. And it's conceivable that at some point that might create some kind of reflexive spasm that really is disruptive, but I really don't think so. I do think it is possible to build new markets from within the publishing core, but I think that publishers would be making a bad judgment if they abandoned their established competencies. So I would say look for opportunities that are easily mimicable. Right? Remember that that's a characteristic of an organizational field. Organizational fields that grow together grow stronger. And in some ways, I think the emergence of audiobooks and the competencies that have emerged within publishing represent this kind of pattern. And so there may be things like that that publishing can move into in the future. I do think that there's probably going to be some continuing mergers and acquisition within publishing. So we'll see some horizontal merges emerging, continuing to emerge, as we've just had very recently with Simon & Schuster. But there are very few firms in publishing that benefit from large-scale vertical integration, I think. Ingram is one case, but there are very few. And I think that there's little disincentive not to continue to aggregate functions within publishing. Now, it's conceivable that regulation might preempt some of these mergers and acquisitions, particularly as we move into high areas of concentration in certain sectors like trade. But I think that publishing is pretty resilient to a lot of interference from government actors. So I think when we think about books, there's really not going to be a lot of pressure on the form of the book. And I think this is also true, despite the changes in academic publishing, on the form of the journal. Certainly not enough to force major shifts in relationships with publishers and between publishers and other sectors. So I do think that North American, European publishers particularly will maintain tight organizational field boundaries. It's interesting to realize that, for example, in some Asian markets, like in Japan, there's a model of a more extensive organizational field within publishing where a work might emerge as manga, be adapted into anime, might create a feature-length film, might generate a novel. But that kind of model, which has its own interesting dynamics, typically is less common in Europe, North America, Latin America, and most other sectors. I can't predict the future, and it's conceivable that this kind of environment could break down. And sociology of markets has very poor predictive capacity. In many ways, it's a weak science. It's just a way of seeing the world and trying to understand how things have evolved to the point where they are. So who knows what will happen, but I hope that this discussion enables us to look at the field of publishing, how it adapted to the possibility of technical change in the past, and understand how it might in the future. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And if there are certainly any questions, I appreciate the opportunity to try to respond to them.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think that was a very inspiring presentation, and you are really challenging us intellectually in the evening, at least here in Europe. So I think that's great. We have already a few questions for you, and let's start with Angus Phillips, who is asking, how disruptive is, in your view, self-publishing?
Yeah, that's a really interesting angle. I think what we've seen is self-publishing has been a market disruptor on the edge. I think that there's been, in many ways, a growth of publishing through the development of self-publishing. The traditional publishing environment is, as we know, only capable of producing so many journals, so many books, and obviously there are a lot of individuals who feel that they have individuals and companies who feel like they have a desire to communicate something. And so I think what's happened with self-publishing is at least bifold. One is there are many authors who might not have been able to enter traditional publishing, and they've been able to seek markets. And I think that there is an opportunity within self-publishing to develop a community of engagement that traditional publishing is poor at in terms of, for example, fan fiction, reader engagement, and so forth. But I don't see that as fundamentally threatening to core publishing. I think that the other thing that self-publishing has enabled is a type of trade or industrial publishing that really didn't have much of a market in traditional publishing. And here I think about the kinds of work that Adam Hyde has done to do book sprints. And example book sprints have been, for example, manuals for developing nations on how to negotiate oil and gas leases for your country, right? So you bring together experts in mineral law, sovereignty, and so forth, and they create an ebook. And then you can distribute that ebook to affected communities. That's not the kind of thing that traditional publishing emerged to do, and I see that as additive. So I think basically self-publishing enlarges the world of publishing more than it subtracts from it.
Okay, there is still some disagreement here, or at least serious questions, which I think is great. So Tiberius is asking you, how is sophism eroding the business of publishing? Is clickbait style content eroding publishing opportunities?
That's interesting. Also, again, I guess I would say that there's erosion through the development of these new forms of communication engagement on the web. People's attention definitely is being diverted to them. I think from a position of thinking about the role of letters in a society, the role of literate discourse, that this has been gravely threatened in some ways by the rise of social media, and also the development of very short information lacking, information poor, clickbait articles from publishers online. And so I do think that there's been an attenuation of focus or attention to longer form or more serious materials. Again, this is like self-publishing. This is a type of erosion, and I think not a core disruption. I don't see the book or the journal being threatened fundamentally by these developments.
Mm-hmm. Anne is picking up on your idea about and your thoughts on data publishing, where you said yourself that this might be a critical edge to your argument. So Anne says, if the traditional book and journal formats stay as they are, then where and how would we expect to find crucial supporting content, as she calls it, such as data sets, images, and so on? How will that work?
Yeah, this is also a really interesting area, I think. I think to some extent, I might have expected a few years ago for more mainstream publishers to more actively support new forms of publication. And that has happened to some extent, where you see academic journals beginning to require data deposit, but not necessarily direct data publishing. So I see that there's a little bit of around the edge of publishing, new types of support firms and organizations emerging that provide the infrastructures necessary to permit this broadening of academic discourse. So things like Figshare or Dryad or other data repositories, many of which are very domain-based in academics. So GeneBank is an example. Protein Database, another example. These tend to serve these particular communities. I think that the rise of imagery and also complex derivative analyses is also going to force the creation of new types of support firms. And yet we are not seeing that within mainstream academic publishing as much as we could. I think, to Anne's point, this is an area that, like audiobooks might be a competence that publishers could develop without disrupting internally their own dynamics, and they could grow their market by beginning to acquire these support firms a little bit more aggressively, and that might be a useful strategy to consider for them. Now, from an academic perspective, you wouldn't want necessarily your Springer or your Elsevier to acquire these companies, but from the perspective of publishers, I think that might be an attractive thing to consider.
Okay, thank you. Jody is asking, how do you see the recent Google lawsuit affecting publishing, if at all?
So Europe and US are a little bit different. So let me be a little snide and ask, which Google lawsuit are you thinking of?
I guess Jody is referring to the US Google lawsuit, right? Is that correct? Jody, do you want to elaborate on that? Now a direct line would be easier. Yeah, the US government.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good question. I suspect that the recent lawsuit will have minimal impact on Google. So I think that what we're seeing in the US is a very complicated upsurge in the desire to regulate technology. Most commentators believe that the current suit against Google is fairly poorly formed, and it impacts only a fairly restricted part of Google's operations, and that part of Google's operations does impact publishing to some extent in terms of the visibility of search results and how things are ranked and included. But I think in the near term, frankly, Google will withstand a lot of this recent interest in trying to break apart the big firms, in part because at least up until now, the regulatory framework within the United States and arguably within Europe hasn't fully comprehended the motivations of these companies and how in the myriad ways in which they do business. I think that will change. And I also think that the rise of attempted regulation of what's called Section 230 in the United States, which provides for a certain type of liability protection for the kinds of content that these platforms host, will be also very interesting to watch in the next 1 to 3 years. There's a lot of pressure on Section 230 right now. I think a lot of internet thinkers believe that to some extent in the US community, that the defense of sort of open publishing on the net, that many firms under attack currently conduct, like YouTube within Google, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and so forth, that the arguments protecting those would pivot if 230 is repealed or severely limited to First Amendment or freedom of speech defenses. And so that's also a sort of an intersect of these regulatory threads. And so Jody's right in that I think this is an area, as I alluded to earlier in my talk, where state regulatory interference could dramatically alter certain opportunities within an organizational field. So sorry, I went a little too long on that one, but in the short term, I think probably not too much impact, but longer term, I think we may see some disruption in how information is propagated, edited, and controlled online that may very well have an impact on certain sectors of publishing.
Yeah, and that's exactly the add-on that Jody is asking for. Do you feel, not asking for, but asking, do you feel that big publishers could face similar situations? And Richard Sharkin is asking, do you think that disruption, which is a little bit of a different twist, but disruption is fundamentally different between STM and trade publishers?
So fundamental disruption, those are two very big words, Richard and Jody. I think that I think that the competitive pressures that trade and STM face are diverging. And I think that they will have to respond in different ways. So in STEM and in higher education, I think the motivation to create learning platforms, research analytic platforms, of embedding publishing initiatives or research support initiatives more deeply within the academic enterprise and research enterprise. It's not just higher ed, but any corporation that does research activities. I think that those compulsions will be a driver in publishing. Again, I would be hesitant to say they'd be fundamentally disruptive, but I do think that they force different competitive issues than in trade. I think in trade, we're seeing perhaps a cyclic but pronounced increase in dependency on blockbusters. This is something that many of us know Mike Shatskin has been discussing quite a bit. I think that there's a lot of pressure on contemporary forms of book distribution, both digital and print, that are different than in STEM. So I do think that the pressures are beginning to diverge more than they had been, but I think that both sectors are going to be fairly resilient.
Thank you. So I see from David Warlock's question that he is not completely convinced yet. David is asking, when do you expect machines to become expert at writing books as well as reading them? When will the language book, article, and so on join codex in history?
I don't, well, to the cheap answer to the second question, I think, is I don't see book becoming the same or entering the same role as codex, but I think the larger point is well taken. And I actually had been invited to write an article for the US organization IBPA, the Independent Book Publishers Association, on the impact of AI on publishing. A very short article, but it hits these points. I do think that AI is rapidly emerging, perhaps faster than many anticipated, to a point where authoring relatively interesting storylines can be developed. So particularly within fairly well capsulated publishing niches or markets like romance, certain types of science fiction. I think it won't be too long before machines could end up producing viable texts. And I think we haven't really dealt with that fully yet. And certainly the legal landscape doesn't fully accommodate machine authored texts yet. And that's also a very interesting stress that people are beginning to try to address. But it is an area of interest. I think this kind of work can also emerge in academia through derivative analyses. And there are already research organizations, both major organizations and major publishers like Elsevier, certainly efforts like the Chan Zuckerberg Institute in San Francisco and Palo Alto that are beginning to try to do fairly sophisticated concept mining of academic texts and produce derivative knowledge that would have been opaque or latent, create associations that are meaningful and vital for new inquiry. So I think that those opportunities could be very disruptive in a 5 to 10 year time frame, but they're still very much reliant on existing publication and publishing models to survive. We haven't really talked about the idea of open access publishing in this domain. That's also potentially disruptive in the academic market of economic models, but I think we've seen a fairly smooth support for open access within the larger traditional publishers. So I don't think that that's going to be as disruptive as many thought it might be.
Mm-hmm. I have one question which is not so much directed at trade publishing and STM publishing, but also within those domains. Do you see probably also regional differences there, for example, by languages? Because I assume talking about English language publications is one thing because of the size of the market. How about smaller languages, and how about more specialized publications there? So we both have been involved with art books, or I'm involved with art books. So you can see that there are really dramatic changes in the marketplace. How would you see them through your conceptual lens, basically?
Yeah, so another excellent and challenging question. I think, first of all, on the language front, that the relative dominance of English, and particularly in the academic sphere, will be very prejudicial toward the development of derivative AI techniques and the development of opportunities for new forms of academic engagement. So I think we'll see those emerging with direct English support. As you note, Sven, the corpus of English academic literature is quite vast, and it is the most accessible literature. There's also, of course, a very large and very rapidly growing Chinese language literature, as well as in other European languages. But in terms of both access, availability, and size, the English literature, I think, will prejudice certain types of activity. I think that there are biases that emerge that are not neutral in that. And I think that that's something to be greatly concerned about. I think countervailing, there's a tendency toward more robust and rapid and machine integrated translation of materials that are able to convey conceptual meaning more readily than had been in the past, and that's something that will be developing rapidly. But I do think that English language dominance affords both opportunities and threats to our ability to understand the world and to share insights across the world. So I'm concerned about that. On issues like art books, I think, art books, travel books, encyclopedias, I think many of these are sectors that we've seen have been massively disrupted by the rise of the internet. I think that, if we think about what those represent, they represent the sharing of knowledge and or of entertainment in particular ways that was prone to sudden disruption and fundamental disruption. They're not as text-based, they're more experiential in many ways, and often more visual. These are aspects that the internet fundamentally supports. And so I do think that those are sectors that the theoretical framework that I suggested in this talk does not support. That they were capsized out of the boat of publishing. And there may be others like those in the future, although I think we've seen probably the most serious impact of the rise of the internet and related technologies on publishing so far.
So no art books in browsers. I get it. Perfect. Thanks a lot.
Sure. I just want to add one other thing, which is, I think that the rise of museum catalogs on the web has been a little bit more difficult than many people imagined. And, so I do think, we often have to reimagine how to express knowledge and entertainment as we move things to the web. But there are sectors like that are susceptible to significant disruption. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. Are there any further questions for Peter? Otherwise, we would move on with a really crazy variation to our structure of the last 2 days, but I don't want to cut it short if there's any other question. Otherwise, Peter, thank you very much for being here today. Thank you for, there's a question from Tiberius. We don't want to skip that one. Do you see publishers becoming content suppliers for personal AI assistants, where the AI is not only reproducing the content, but repurposing the content in a certain way?
Yes, I think that is insightful. I do think that 5 to 10 years out, that there will be opportunities for publishers essentially to integrate their content production processes into essentially new forms of distribution and create new opportunities for integration that are AI enabled. So I do think that that's a smart glimmer of the future. I certainly am not smart enough to understand how that will work, but I think for example, one near field prototype of that might be support for birding, of all things, where you see apps beginning not just to recognize birdsong, just like Shazam can recognize songs, but begin to integrate other aspects of knowledge once that bird has been recognized. So those apps are beginning to integrate, to bring in different types of content and represent it to the user in a different form of interaction. And I think that's possible to envision both within nonfiction trade as content becomes more marked up digitally, more thoroughly tagged, but certainly also within STEM. And I do think that there's some very interesting opportunities. And here I think Tiberius is pointing toward an area of arguably necessary investigation and investment by at least STEM publishers. So I would definitely encourage more thought about that.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Peter. And as announced, we are doing something